Hello, my lovely Taurus. This reading is for Taurus Sun, Moon, Rising, and Venus. Take a moment to relax. Take a deep breath and open your heart to whatever may be coming through in today's reading. If something resonates with you, take it in the way that feels right for your journey. If it doesn't, simply let it pass by. Okay. The energy that's really standing out to me right now feels connected to someone who can no longer keep pushing their feelings aside. It feels like they're moving through a period of deep reflection. The things that happened between the two of you seem to be replaying in their mind, but they're seeing everything from a completely different perspective now. And honestly, I don't get the feeling that this is some impulsive wave of nostalgia or a passing emotion. This feels much deeper than that. It's almost like someone is beginning to recognize the value of something they once believed they could leave behind and move on from. Sometimes people don't fully understand what something means to them until enough time has passed for them to see it clearly. And the more I sit with this energy, the more I feel like something is shifting inside this person. Not in a loud way. Not in a dramatic way. Wow, it's actually much quieter than that, much more subtle. But it's powerful enough that they can no longer keep pretending everything is fine. There's something changing beneath the surface, and I think they're starting to feel it too. There's something really interesting coming through in this energy, Taurus, because the very first thing I'm picking up is not someone who's successfully moving on. It's someone who's tried very hard to move on and just hasn't been able to. The Six of Cups card comes through almost immediately. And what's interesting is that this doesn't feel loud. It doesn't feel like someone constantly texting. It doesn't feel like someone trying to get attention or force their way back into your life. This feels much quieter than that, much deeper than that. It's like someone is living their life, going to work, seeing people, taking care of their responsibilities, doing everything they're supposed to do. But in those quiet spaces in between, their mind keeps drifting back to a familiar place, back to old conversations, back to little moments that once seemed insignificant, back to things they honestly believed they had forgotten. The thing that really stands out here is that they're not trying to think about you. The memories just show up, a song, a street they drive down, a certain scent, a random phrase somebody says, and suddenly, there you are again. It's almost like the harder they try to set those memories down, the more they seem to come back. The Moon card appears right beside this energy. And wow, this goes deep. Because this person isn't just remembering what happened between the two of you. They're beginning to face emotions they never fully allowed themselves to look at before. I feel like there were things pushed aside in the past. Feelings they avoided. Thoughts they kept explaining away. They convinced themselves it wasn't that important. They told themselves time would take care of it. That eventually everything would fade. That eventually they'd be fine. But the farther they've moved away from this connection, the more they've realized something is still there. It never truly disappeared. It never really left. It simply settled into a very quiet corner of their heart. Honestly, I can also feel a sense of regret here. Not regret over one specific moment, not one specific conversation. It's regret over things that were never said, conversations that never happened, feelings that never found their voice. There are moments when this person is alone with their thoughts. No distractions, no work, no social plans, no noise from the outside world, just themselves and the silence. And in those moments, the Nine of Swords card becomes impossible to ignore. This doesn't feel like someone who's completely at peace. I think they carry far more thoughts than anyone around them realizes. Questions keep circling through their mind. What if I had handled things differently? What if I had been honest about how I felt? What if I hadn't let my pride get in the way? The interesting thing is that these questions don't always need answers. They just keep returning, again and again. And I think something important is happening because of that. They're starting to see everything from a much more mature perspective. They're no longer looking only at what they wanted. They're no longer looking only through their own lens. They're trying to step into your shoes, trying to understand what this experience may have felt like from your side, trying to see things they never truly saw before. And as that happens, I can feel a shift taking place inside of them. The Four of Swords card appears here almost like a long pause, not the pause of an ending, more like the pause of reflection. It's as if life has gently placed them in a position where they have no choice but to sit with themselves. No more running, no more filling every empty space with distractions, just sitting there, looking back, feeling everything, acknowledging that there is someone who has remained in their thoughts far longer than they ever expected. And honestly, I don't think this person is only thinking about the past anymore. Because the more they look back on what once existed between the two of you, the more they begin to recognize the value of what was lost. And that's usually when things begin to change. Because once someone stops focusing on forgetting, they often start asking a very different question. What if this wasn't really over in the way I convinced myself it was? That question seems to be leading them somewhere very different. Because once those initial emotions begin to settle, what remains is no longer just longing. I see observation. I see admiration. I see someone looking at you through a completely different lens than they did before. The Empress card comes through very strongly here. And what's interesting is that this energy isn't about putting you on some impossible pedestal. It's not that. They're seeing the real you, the everyday parts of you, the way you've handled challenges, the way you've picked yourself back up after difficult moments, the way you've continued moving forward even when life didn't unfold the way you hoped it would. Honestly, it feels like there was a time when they only saw a small piece of who you were. Now they're starting to see the whole picture, and wow. I think that realization has surprised them, because they're beginning to understand how many valuable things they overlooked. The Queen of Pentacles card comes through with such a warm feeling. You know, some people leave an impression because they're exciting, because they're flashy, because they command attention. But other people stay in your heart because of the peace they bring. And honestly, Taurus, I feel like that's the energy surrounding you here. This person seems to be realizing that in a world that's constantly changing, you were one of the few things that felt steady. Not because you're perfect, but because around you they never felt pressured to become someone else. They could simply be themselves, and I think that means more to them now than it ever did before. The Star card appears above all of this almost like a soft light, not overwhelming, not demanding attention, just quietly present, always there. I get the sense that during this period of distance, they've met different people, had different conversations, experienced different chapters of life. But the more experiences they've gathered, the more they've realized that not everyone leaves them feeling the way you do. Because what they miss isn't just attraction, it isn't only chemistry, it isn't only emotional intensity. It's the feeling of being understood, being heard, being accepted. And honestly, those are often the things people don't fully appreciate until they're no longer there. There's something else showing up here that's really interesting. This person is beginning to compare who you are now with the version of you they carried in their mind for so long. And they're realizing those two images are no longer the same. You've changed, you've grown, you've become stronger, more grounded, more confident in yourself. It feels like life has taught you a great deal since the first time your paths crossed. And they see that now. They truly see it. The Strength card comes through almost like confirmation. Not loud strength. Not performative strength. Not the kind that needs to prove itself. This feels like inner strength. The quiet confidence of someone who's been through enough to know who they are. Someone who no longer needs validation from the outside world to feel secure in their own worth. And honestly, I think they admire that more than they may ever admit. Maybe they've never said it out loud. Maybe they've never shown it directly. But what I'm picking up is that they're learning to respect you in a completely new way. They're no longer viewing you through old expectations. They're no longer viewing you through old assumptions. They're beginning to see you as the person you've become. And the more closely they look, the more they realize there are qualities within you that are actually very rare. I can still feel a trace of regret woven through this energy. Not regret for what was lost, but regret for how long it took them to recognize the value of what they once had. Because sometimes when something is close to us, we assume it will always be there. Then distance appears, silence appears, life moves forward, and suddenly we're forced to experience our days without that familiar presence. That's often where perspective begins to change. And what really stands out to me now is that this person isn't only looking backward anymore. They're beginning to ask themselves a different question. If what I feel for this person is real, if what I'm finally seeing now is the truth, then should I really keep all of this to myself the way I always have? It feels like that very question is opening a much larger door inside of them. The Hermit card is the first thing that comes through in this part of the reading. And honestly, this doesn't feel like loneliness. It doesn't feel like isolation. It feels like someone finally sitting down with themselves. Really sitting with themselves. You know, there are seasons in life when people look everywhere for answers. They look to friends, to family, to other people's opinions, to advice, to outside voices that all seem to be saying something different. This person has been there. I feel like they spent a long time listening to everyone except their own heart. And that created a lot of noise, a lot of confusion, a lot of inner conflict. There were so many moments when they convinced themselves their feelings didn't really matter, that everything would eventually pass, that choosing the easier path was automatically the right path. But something seems to have shifted recently, because once those outside voices started fading into the background, they finally began hearing their own. And wow, that voice is quiet, very quiet, but it's real. Real enough that they can't ignore it anymore. I'm seeing them look back over this entire journey from a completely different perspective. They're no longer trying to decide who's right and who's wrong. They're no longer trying to prove anything. They're simply looking at things for what they were, and in that stillness, the Ace of Swords card appears. The energy of this card moves in quickly, almost like a moment when everything suddenly becomes clear. You know that feeling. When something has been sitting right in front of you for the longest time, but somehow you don't truly see it until one specific day. That's exactly what this feels like. Not because somebody explained it to them, not because somebody convinced them, because the truth revealed itself. The truth about their feelings. The truth about what they've been trying to push away. The truth about the place you still hold in their heart. And the more I sit with this energy, the more I feel like certain fears are beginning to lose their grip on them. The fear of getting hurt, the fear of losing control, the fear of opening themselves completely to another person. Those fears once stopped them, held them back, made them choose silence when honesty was asking to be heard. The Death card sits right in the middle of this reading like a very clear line in the sand. Something is ending here, not the connection, not the feelings, not the memories. It's an older version of themselves, the version that always stayed guarded, the version that questioned everything, the version that needed certainty before allowing itself to feel anything at all. And honestly, I can sense some surprise within them. Because the deeper they go into this realization, the more they recognize that their heart never truly left you behind. Distance may have happened. Life may have moved in different directions. They may have tried focusing on other things. They may have created 100 different explanations for why everything unfolded the way it did. But the feelings remained, quietly, patiently, steadily, far more persistent than they ever expected. There is a moment where the Judgment card starts coming through very strongly. And wow, it almost feels like a bell ringing after a very long silence, a realization that changes something permanently, a truth that, once seen, cannot be unseen, because they're beginning to understand something important. Not every person who enters our lives leaves the same impact. Not every connection changes us from the inside out. Not every person remains on our mind after all this time. And as all of these pieces begin fitting together, I feel like they're standing at a very significant threshold, a place where they're no longer focused only on what happened. Instead, they're beginning to wonder what might happen if they chose differently this time, if they allowed themselves to be more honest about how they feel, if they stopped letting fear make every decision, if, for once, they allowed their heart to have a voice too. It feels like that thought alone is beginning to set something in motion inside of them. They're no longer standing still, no longer watching from a distance, no longer thinking about everything and then locking it away inside themselves. The Page of Cups card comes through very gently here, very softly, almost like an emotion that's been sitting in the dark for a long time and is finally trying to find its way into the light. And what's interesting is that this person doesn't seem nearly as concerned with saying the perfect thing anymore. They're not searching for the perfect words. They're not trying to build the perfect plan before taking action. Because the more they've thought about it, the more they've realized something important. The distance between the two of you wasn't created because there weren't enough perfect conversations. It was created because there were too many things left unsaid. Honestly, I feel like they've rehearsed countless conversations in their head, opening messages, explanations, questions they want to ask you, things they've wanted to admit. There are moments when they pick up their phone and then put it back down. They open a message window, then close it again, not because they don't want to reach out, because real feelings make people vulnerable. And vulnerability is often far scarier than most people are willing to admit. The Knight of Cups card begins moving closer into the reading, and this energy feels different from what we've seen before. Because for the first time, I'm not just seeing them think about their own feelings. They're beginning to think about yours. They're wondering what you've been through, how you've been feeling, whether you'd even want to hear from them, whether that door is still open, or whether you've already stepped fully into a different chapter of your life. And honestly, there's something much more mature about the way they're approaching this now. This doesn't feel like someone wanting to return simply to ease their own loneliness. It feels like someone who genuinely wants to face what was left unfinished. There's something very sincere about this energy, very simple, very human. Almost like someone finally finding the courage to say, I don't want to keep pretending I don't care anymore. The Eight of Wands card appears almost immediately after that. And wow, this energy moves fast. It feels like after standing still for so long, everything inside of them is suddenly accelerating. Thoughts that took months to form are now connecting almost all at once. Things they never understood before are beginning to make sense. Things they avoided for a long time are becoming impossible to avoid. And honestly, I don't see someone who wants to wait much longer. Because the longer they wait, the more they feel like time is slipping away. And perhaps for the first time in a very long time, they're realizing that opportunities don't always remain available forever. Some doors only stay open for a certain amount of time. Some people aren't meant to stand still and wait forever. That realization seems to be creating a powerful pressure inside of them. Not a negative pressure, more like motivation. Motivation to do something differently. Motivation to stop living entirely inside their thoughts. Motivation to step beyond the comfort zone they've been hiding in. The Three of Pentacles card brings in a very grounded energy. And honestly, I really like this part of the reading. Because it doesn't feel overly dreamy. It doesn't feel unrealistic. This person isn't only thinking about emotions anymore. They're thinking about how to close the gap. How to begin a mature conversation. How to rebuild something that was left unfinished. I'm also noticing that they're taking more responsibility. They're no longer blaming circumstances. No longer blaming timing. No longer blaming outside factors. They're beginning to look honestly at the role they played in this story. And I have to say, that's a significant shift. Because when someone becomes willing to acknowledge their part, they're usually much closer to creating something new. What stands out most is that this energy no longer carries the same hesitation we've been seeing before. It feels like someone who's been wandering through a maze for a very long time and finally catches sight of an exit. Not every answer is there yet. Not every fear has disappeared, but there's enough clarity to take another step forward. And while they're standing at that threshold, I can feel another question beginning to form in their mind. Okay, what if the two of you really did have the chance to talk again? What if this story could become something bigger than either of you once believed was possible? I think this is exactly where the energy begins to shift in a very noticeable way. Because for most of this journey, this person has been focused on what already happened. The things left unsaid, the things left undone, the opportunities that slipped away. But honestly, when I look at the reading now, that energy doesn't feel nearly as strong. Their mind is starting to move forward. Not with urgency, not with some distant fantasy, but with very simple images, very ordinary images, very real ones. The Ace of Pentacles card appears almost like a doorway opening. And what's coming through here isn't a grand promise. It's actually the opposite. This person is thinking about specific things, a steady conversation, a connection that can last, a meaningful presence in each other's lives. It feels like they're tired of living inside assumptions, tired of asking what if, tired of wondering how things might have been different. They want a real opportunity to build something, one step at a time. And wow, there's a beautiful maturity showing up in this energy. Because there was a time when they could be swept away by emotions, swept away by fear, swept away by impulsive reactions. Now they're thinking about stability. They're thinking about what truly matters, what actually holds value over time. And what really stands out is that every time they picture the future, you seem to be there, not as some distant dream, not as an impossible fantasy, but as someone they genuinely like to share life with. The King of Cups card sits very close to the center of the reading. And honestly, this card carries such a sincere feeling here. I feel like this person is becoming more honest with their emotions than they've been in a long time. There were feelings they tried to control, feelings they tried to hide, feelings they tried to keep entirely to themselves. But as they've grown, they're beginning to realize that emotions aren't always something that needs to be fought against. Sometimes they're something that needs to be listened to, you know? I see them imagining very ordinary things. Long conversations at the end of the day, sharing little details that most people would probably overlook. The kind of days where nothing extraordinary happens, but you still want to tell someone about them. And I mean, that sounds simple, but those are the moments that seem to affect them the most. Because deep down, this person isn't chasing excitement anymore. They're searching for a sense of belonging, a place that feels like home, someone whose presence allows them to exhale. The Four of Wands card comes through with such a warm energy. I don't see anything flashy here. I don't see exaggerated promises. I see someone slowly learning the value of partnership, the value of having someone beside you, the value of building something that can withstand the passing of time. Maybe there was a period when they believed love was supposed to be intense all the time, full of dramatic highs and lows, constant emotional fireworks. But this experience seems to be teaching them something different, something much quieter. It's teaching them the value of consistency, the value of someone who shows up, the value of a connection that remains standing when life becomes complicated. And what's really interesting is that they're no longer thinking only about themselves. They're beginning to think about where they fit into your life, whether there's a place for them within the future you're creating, whether they could become part of the plans you're building, whether that door remains open, or whether it quietly closed a long time ago. The Ten of Cups card appears very softly, but it stays present throughout this entire energy, almost like a picture they've never allowed themselves to look at for too long. A picture of lasting connection, of sharing years together, of no longer questioning whether someone is going to stay. And honestly, I feel like they're finally allowing themselves to imagine possibilities like that. Not because they suddenly have all the answers, not because everything is figured out, but because for the first time in a very long time, those possibilities feel worth exploring. And when someone begins seeing the future through that lens, a very important thought usually follows. A thought that changes everything. Maybe it's time to stop imagining what they want and start moving toward it. I think this is the moment where the energy truly changes direction. This is no longer just an inner journey. No longer thoughts that exist only inside their mind. No longer feelings hidden behind layer after layer of protection. Because what I'm seeing now is someone arriving at a point where they understand that the awareness alone doesn't change anything. At some point, it has to be followed by action. The Chariot card comes through very clearly here. And honestly, this doesn't feel rushed at all. It doesn't feel impulsive. It doesn't feel like someone acting on a temporary emotional wave. Quite the opposite. This feels like someone who's spent a very long time thinking. Someone who's gone through countless mental loops, asked themselves hundreds of questions, and eventually realized that no new answers are going to appear if they keep standing in the same place. You know, it almost feels like they're tired. Tired of watching their life from the sidelines. Tired of waiting for the perfect moment. Tired of convincing themselves that somehow everything will just work itself out on its own. Because deep down, they know there are certain doors that only open when someone is willing to walk toward them. The Emperor card carries a very strong presence here. And what's interesting is that this doesn't feel exactly like the person you once knew, at least not entirely. Something more mature is showing up, something more grounded. This person seems to be learning how to take responsibility for their own choices. No longer waiting for someone else to decide for them. No longer waiting for circumstances to change first. No longer waiting for everything to become easy before taking action. They're beginning to understand that maturity often means accepting the outcome of the choices we make, whatever that outcome may be. And wow, one thing that really stands out is that they seem far less focused on whether everything will unfold perfectly. What matters more to them now is whether they're being honest with themselves, whether they're actually living in alignment with what their heart already knows to be true. The Justice card sits right at the center of this energy, and it brings such a clear feeling. It's like they're looking back at everything with more clarity than they've ever had before. They're no longer being pulled around by extreme emotions, no longer trapped inside old assumptions, no longer holding on to stories they've repeated to themselves for years. Instead, they're facing the truth, the comfortable truths, the uncomfortable truths. All of it, everything is being placed on the table. And honestly, that's creating a huge shift. Because only when someone becomes truly honest with themselves do they begin to understand what they genuinely want. I can also feel that some of the things that once stood in the way of this connection are gradually losing their power. It doesn't necessarily feel like a specific person. It doesn't necessarily feel like a specific circumstance. Sometimes it's old beliefs, old fears, old limitations they placed on themselves, old voices that taught them to doubt their own feelings. And somehow those things don't seem as powerful anymore. The King of Wands card appears like a very steady flame, and I actually like the word steady more than intense here. Because this energy isn't chaotic. It doesn't feel reckless. It feels like someone who has already made a decision within themselves. And once that decision is made, they don't really want to return to who they used to be. What stands out most is that they no longer feel the need to prove anything through words alone. They want actions to speak. They want their presence to mean something. They want to show that they're serious. They want to show that these feelings aren't something that appeared for a moment and then disappeared. Because honestly, there may have been times in the past when they were difficult to understand, times when they sent mixed signals, times when they moved forward only to pull back again, times when hesitation seemed to control everything. This energy doesn't feel like that anymore. What I'm seeing now is someone entering a stage where clarity matters more than comfort, where honesty matters more than protecting their ego. And when someone starts making choices from that place, something very interesting tends to happen. The distance between thought and action begins to shrink. What once existed only in their mind slowly starts finding its way into the real world. And honestly, Taurus, I feel like they're standing very close to that moment now. Very close to the point where they stop asking themselves what they should do and start asking themselves what the best way is to show up in front of you again. And Taurus, I think the most beautiful part of this reading isn't necessarily about what may happen next. It's about what's changing inside someone's heart. Because sometimes people have to travel a very long road before they truly recognize what matters to them. And sometimes distance becomes the very thing that helps them see everything more clearly. If something in this reading resonated with you, take what feels right for your own journey. And if it doesn't, simply let it pass by. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. Your presence here means more to this channel than you probably realize. And honestly, I appreciate every single one of you who stayed and listened all the way through. Please continue taking care of yourself. Continue trusting your own worth. Continue moving forward at the pace that feels right for you. Because your journey doesn't have to look like anyone else's. I'll be back very soon with another reading. And until then, take a deep breath, be gentle with yourself, and keep your heart open to whatever lessons, clarity, or opportunities life may place in front of you. Okay, Taurus, thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye for now, Taurus.